All right, so this is the fourth Porsche 911 that I've reviewed on this channel, making it the single model of car that I reviewed the most, just barely edging out the 3 Series. And that's because I love Porsche 911s. They're one of my favorite cars in the entire world. And I figured since this is the third 991.2 generation car that I've reviewed, I'm probably gonna skip out on some of the minutia, talking about stuff like the interior, the exterior looks. Most of you guys already know that, and if you really want to see my opinion on it, there are 2 other videos which I'll link in the description box below that I go through all that stuff in a bit more. I'm also going to skip out on the tall boy test here because, spoiler alert, it's just 2 tall boys. The 911 is not a tall boy beast, and this car is pretty loaded up, so it gives me a chance to now explore the Carrera S model. I've driven the base 991.2, I've driven a GTS. Still looking forward to driving some GT cars and turbo cars from this generation, but now that I'm in a loaded up Carrera S, this happens to have actually one mod, and it kind of got me thinking, should you mod a Porsche 911? So throughout this video, we're going to explore that topic a bit and see how the Carrera S stacks up to the base 911 and to the GTS. So first, let's find out more about this car. This is a 2017 991.2 Porsche 911 Carrera S, and it started life back in 2017 at just over $104,000, but this is a pretty loaded car, rounding the bases at just under $140,000. Now, I know what you're thinking, that's actually more than the starting price at the time of a GTS model, which was about 120 grand. But the big price is because this Carrera S is just shy of a full-on GTS as it's spec'd today. It has the coveted P3P sports package, which gives you a slightly smaller steering wheel diameter, about 15 millimeters less here. It gives you sports design mirrors. It also gives you a sports chrono package and rear axle steer. Now that gives you kind of a lot of the base factors of a GTS. On top of that, this car has the PASM sport suspension that sits also about 20 millimeters lower than the standard 911. You feel that for sure. It's quite low, and this does not have the front axle lift, which I don't think is necessarily needed, but again, you have to be very wary of all dips and ingresses out of and into driveways. And this particular car has the Sport Seat Plus, which even the GTS I drove was missing, and they just look really nice, and they're very aggressively bolstered as compared to the standard seats in a 911. So sure, you get all of that and even more in a GTS, including a slightly more aggressive front bumper, the wider body in the rear, you have center lock wheels, you have larger turbos with more boost, and a couple other little things. But on the used market, where the owner of this car was able to buy this, you're still looking at about a $10,000 to $15,000 difference at least between this and a GTS. And look, if money was no object, I would get a GTS because you get all of this and a bit more, again, obviously. So everything considered, this is a solid value proposition. Now, the Carrera S is powered by a 3-liter twin turbocharged 6-cylinder flat 6-cylinder motor, and that produces 420 horsepower and 368 pound-feet of torque here in the Carrera S. Here it's mated to a 7-speed PDK dual clutch transmission, which is fantastic. Of course, you could also get a 7-speed manual. I have yet to try that, and I am itching to try that transmission, but the PDK is absolutely fantastic, and it's probably the best automatic or dual clutch transmission on the entire market, considering that this is a brilliant transmission and very nice for daily driving. This car is sitting on RS Spider design wheels, which are 8.5 inches wide up front, 11.5 inches in the rear, 245 rubber up front, 305 rubber in the rear, sitting at 20 inches in diameter on Michelin PS4S tires, which are my favorite summies. They are like the best all-around summer tire for SoCal climate, climates like SoCal, I should say. And they make for a ton of grip, both in a straight line as well as in the corners. And I definitely suggest putting those on any performance car, unless you want to go crazy with R compounds, but these are very livable performance tires. And with tires like these, Car and Driver has tested a rear-wheel drive Carrera S just like this car to 60 miles an hour with the Sports Chrono launch control at 3.1 seconds, which is blisteringly quick, plenty fast, I would say. And probably due to the combination of wide rear rubber, a lot of weight in the rear over those rear tires, and launch control, along with a lot of turbo boost, which you get in these new .2 cars, and obviously then in the 992s as well. Now that we've established the baseline, let's get this car out onto the road and discuss more about mods. All right, so setting off here in the Carrera S, I'm currently in sport mode, and I'm gonna leave the car in the sport driving mode because Sport Plus is only really good if you're gonna put the hammer down, and I'm keeping things nice and simple here. I have the owner of this car as my passenger, and I do not want to go too crazy, but in sport mode, everything tightens up. The car is actually, the sport PASM suspension is not turned on, so I'm gonna leave that off for now. Maybe I'll toy with that later. The sports exhaust is turned on, and the accelerator pedal is a bit more sensitive and sharp, and the steering is a bit tighter. So I'm really a fan of sport mode. It also gives you the most burbles in the exhaust when you're in sport mode. In Sport Plus, it kind of turns them off entirely. Now, driving this car, there's no denying that the GTS I drove was a bit more powerful than this car, because it literally is, and it is obviously then the next trim level up, so you'd expect it to be, even more dynamic. But I also mentioned that the Base 991.2 that I drove was like the perfect purest spec, and I still stand by that, because you can really take a Base 911 to the limit in a way that you can't in any other 911. I mean, the second you get into this, a GTS, and anything beyond that, you have to restrain yourself more. And sure, even a Base 911 is a very capable car, but there's a certain sense of, it's not overpowering the chassis in any way, and you can take that car closer to what you'd call the limit on city roads, whereas you find yourself needing to get out into the canyons or onto the track to push a Carrera S like this or a GTS closer to its limits. Now, with the PASM suspension that this car has, and I believe the GTS that I drove also had, the car is really, really tight to the road. Now, I'm gonna take that as an opportunity to quickly throw the suspension on, and when the chassis goes into sport mode, I mean, you start feeling all the bumps and all the undulations in the road. Now, I've said it about 95 times already. The steering is telepathic here in the 911, and it's really impressive for an EPS system, right? You don't usually get this in most modern cars. You usually get a bit of a dull steering feel, and Porsche has somehow cooked some feel in. And again, I've said it many times before. There's also a sense of occasion that comes with driving any 911. So again, here in a Carrera S, just like in the Base and just like in the GTS, I feel, sorry, there were some rocks there. I feel special the second I'm driving this, even just cruising around right now at about 45 miles an hour, not pushing the car to its limits by any means. I know I'm in something special. I know I'm not in your typical car, for sure. And that's considering this car could, and very well is for many people, a daily driver. Now, I do want to mention that compared to the Base 991 and compared to that GTS, this car has 50 more horsepower than the base car and 37 more pound-feet of torque than the base car. It also has 30 less horsepower than the GTS and exactly 37 pound-feet of torque less than the GTS. So it basically sits right in the middle torque-wise and a little bit closer to the GTS power-wise, but it really is the middle ground, and that's why I'm happy to review this car as well and compare it, as it is that kind of missing puzzle as it is that missing puzzle piece in the Carrera lineup, at least here in the 991.2 911s. Now, I mentioned this car has a mod, and it's a mod that I'm a huge fan of. It's a Shark Werks exhaust. It's an exhaust specifically meant for cars already equipped with the Porsche sports exhaust, which again, this car being a P3P car has. And on top of that, it's just basically a muffler that still allows you to maintain the valves you have in the Porsche sports exhaust. So you get, when you put the car into its normal drive mode, it closes the valves, kind of keeps itself a bit more tame. Into sport mode, you open those valves up, you get a bunch of burbles, and in Sport Plus mode, the burbles go away, but you keep that loud noise, and you kind of basically have three choices there as to what you want to hear. That Shark Werks exhaust also gives you about what they claim 19 wheel horsepower, and if they're claiming a little bit extra power, then that exhaust actually helps bridge the gap between this car and the GTS even more. But more than bridge the gap power-wise, what it really does is sound fantastic. I'm gonna be honest, no turbo 911 sounds nearly as good as the naturally aspirated 911s did and as the GT3 cars still do, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much throatier and more aggressive and less vacuum-like this car sounds versus, say, that GTS I drove, which had the Porsche sports exhaust, the same exhaust this car came with standard, but lacked a lot of that depth and tone you have in this car. I'm not gonna blab on anymore. I'm gonna let you guys listen to the exhaust now, put some clips in, and we'll get back to the car after. now that you guys have heard the exhaust, hopefully it's translated in the video. You can hear that it's a bit more throaty and it sounds a bit more special. I also really like that these 991.2 generation cars don't have a soft limiter, whereas the 992, at least the 992 Carrera S that I drove a few months back, did have a soft limiter and would not let you rev no matter whether you were in neutral or in park. It wouldn't let you go past about 4K while at a standstill, which is a real shame. This does let you go to red line. I also really just like that it has the OEM exhaust tips. I'm a really big fan of that OEM plus vibe on a car, and this maintains that. It looks stock, but it sounds a little better, and it's perfect to basically fool somebody into thinking it's a 100% stock car. That's the kind of modding I'm into. It's the kind of modding that you kind of would have to know. It's like one of those if you know, you know type things, or it fools you into thinking the car is just this good, even though you've tweaked a couple little things. You've lowered it a tiny bit, thrown spacers on it, you know, done little tweaks. But because this car is indeed, in that one sense, modded, it did get the gears going in my head as to should you mod a 911 at all, and to what extent should you really go? All right. Now, in my opinion, the 911 has always been an amazing product for its time, and this being a relatively new 911 and more similar than not to the 992s, it's just a fantastic car, and it's a very capable sports car for the money. I always, and I already mentioned this, but I always noticed how much more tactile and almost analog the 911 is compared to most cars of this relative era that we now exist in. And this car is no different. Now, sure, the base car, like I said, you can push a little bit more to the limits while on city roads. And when you do get into this and the GTS, you find yourself having to kind of slightly hold yourself back at certain points in time, which is not a shame. It's just a reality of having a more powerful car and a car that can more quickly take you to the limits of traction on the streets. But since we're here in the canyons, and without making, again, the owner of this car too pissed at me, I'm gonna quickly give you guys a little example of this car's performance prowess, which is that it takes off like that and quickly gets into illegal speeds and allows you to take corners. I mean, it just feels like a joke in this car. I don't want to say that it makes my car suck, but it really is a whole nother level of performance car, and this is a true sports car for the money, whereas, you know, there are a lot of performance-oriented cars, say that BMW M850i that I drove last year, that are not, in my opinion, true sports cars the way that a 911 is for the same money. So now that I've given you a little taste of what this car, as you guys can see, is capable of, I'm sure anyone watching this knows how capable, or just how capable a 911 really is. I want to kind of continue discussing the mods. I guess what I'm trying to build on here is that I don't necessarily think that modding a 911 is really worth it. Now again, we're talking about stuff like this exhaust system, worth it. Slight tweaks like spacers, a nice set of performance and motorsport wheels, if you're into that kind of thing, worth it. And maybe a modest ECU tune, worth it. But if we're talking about entirely changing kind of the core dynamics of a 911, so much so as you're moving then into the next trim level of 911, it's probably not worth it. And what I mean there is, there's about 40 different versions of the 911. And I'm not gonna go into exactly what there is, because I'm sure most of you know what they are, and maybe I'll put a little graphic up that gives you a basic idea. But once you spend about 5 grand, 10 grand on a 911, you might as well have gotten the next trim level up, right? You spend a bunch of money on a base Carrera, you should have gotten Carrera S. Carrera S, you spend a bunch of money, you should have got a GTS, so on and so forth. And you quickly find yourself at a GT3. Now, whether or not you have the money to buy a GT3 new or used, and the values are certainly moving upward right now in the crazy used market, but considering a used GT3 is still a car that can be found sub $120,000, it doesn't really make a great case for you to spend $10,000 or $15,000 modifying a Carrera S like this and basically having spent the money of a GT3, unless you just need either A, a turbocharged car, or B, an all-wheel drive car, in which case I do understand maybe slightly modifying a Carrera 4 GTS or something of the sort. Those of you familiar with Matt Farah know that he often mentions the concept of tuning out of class. And it's so easy to tune out of class in the 911 because Porsche themselves have created various and numerous classes of 911. All you really need to get a better Porsche 911 is some money and or some patience. Now, those are not easy things to come across or come by in today's world, but the major point that I'm trying to get to, and I gotta be more concise in saying, is that really if you have the money to blow on making a Carrera S a souped up amazing sports car, you're really better off just getting a GT3. But for me to take what is otherwise a very well sorted and well balanced machine in a Porsche 911 and to largely alter that, it's just not my cup of tea. So as I've mentioned numerous times now, this is a bit more tame than the GTS that I drove, and that's to be expected. But again, I wouldn't really spend any significant money to turn this into a GTS beyond the options that Porsche themselves have offered and have been equipped on this car, because I don't think you're gonna see a return on the secondary market. And I'll be honest, Porsche just does it better most of the time. They are a brand that still seems to care and believe in motorsports and is fueled more by enthusiasts, at least when it comes to 911 range, than they are by the average consumer. Obviously, they have kind of offset that by now offering not only a variety of SUVs, but also the Taycan that sell extremely well and probably allow for them to make a car like this. But this car is meant for the enthusiasts. Even a base 911, even a Carrera S, even a GTS, they are meant for enthusiasts, and surely cars like GT3s and turbos and those cars are all meant for enthusiasts. I would work my way up that line rather than alter a car to be something that it's not within that relative family of Porsches or 911s. And on that note, if you have the money to really mess with a 911, do yourself a favor, step into the next trim level. You're always gonna find something that's been done a little bit better by Porsche, that's standard on the car, and offers you a better value retention on the used market. And Lord knows these are seemingly at the very least holding, if not going up in value right now with the ridiculously booming used car market. So buy into that, do what makes you happy. My opinion is not to mod a Porsche 911 too much beyond some basic stuff. And this exhaust is a fantastic, fantastic mod. Affordable, sounds great, and it's only made this driving experience a bit more pleasurable. And on that note, before we wrap up, we'll do one last little pull here. You guys can hear that lovely exhaust wake up. It's fantastic. If you guys enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. I want to thank Max, who is the owner of this car, who's let me borrow it and has tolerated me while making this video. If you guys have any suggestions for cars you want me to film with, I will do my best to make it happen. Comment down below. As always, this is Rio. Peace.